Well, hi, Kinascom Tinawao, everyone. Blake Desjarlais, Nisagasan, Pak Johanse, Miskutu Skaigan on Sinia, Otapenasoak, Pitagosania, and the Hiwak. My name is Blake Desjarlais. I'm really proud to be here with all of you today. It's really remarkable any opportunity I have to spend time with folks who are really interested and engaged with work related to reconciliation or largely the lack thereof in our country. And I think that there is so much more work that has to be done, not just to ensure that we have a place as Indigenous people in our country, but to also rebuild what has been lost in many ways or just uncovered. And it's no secret, I think, to many nations that our communities are very resilient and have a lot to offer. And I really want to recognize all those persons who are coming from other nations across Turtle Island, Casey from Treaty 8, and maybe even Treaty 7, some folks are here, and some of the other historic treaty and traditional areas, including the unceded territories. So I'm connecting with all of you from the unceded Algonquin territories here, unceded Algonquin and Anishinaabe territories in Ottawa. And I've had a great welcoming in my space here, and we opened my presence here in a good way. We met with the nation and Shannon Chief, who is one of the elders who helped to open up, I guess, a welcoming space for me as a newly elected member of Parliament, doing some good work on behalf of hopefully our communities and many more communities in Turtle Island. And so I'm not super familiar, Casey, if there was some questions or if you just wanted me to go into some things about myself right now and a little bit of the work I do and my experience, or if you wanted to do it a different way.
No, totally up to you. If you wanted to jump right in and kind of tell us your story, and then we can do some questions and answered after, that would be great.
Sure, of course. So my story is one that's unconventional to many Canadians, especially Canadians who don't have a huge experience with the reality of Indigenous peoples in Canada. My story is also unique in the sense that it focuses on a really small and often forgotten about chapter of Canada's Indigenous people, which is certainly the Métis settlements. And when we think about the Métis settlements where I grew up in one that's called Pakchahanse, we call it. So it means Cree, it's Cree for netting lake, but it's also been a really long time historic wagon trail community, meaning that very close to Fishing Lake is the Fort Carlton Trail, which some of you might know from research during the late 1800s was largely the transport corridor for the resistance wars that my ancestors participated in. And so before I get to that chapter, or before I get to where I'm at, I think it's really important to situate ourselves in the history of Canada, because the history of Canada is something we can't relegate, we can't forget, because it has a tremendous impact on our systems still today, individuals still today, communities, nations right now. And so when we think about the context in Canada, I think many of you probably have some of this knowledge, but in order to summarize for those so we're all on the same page, the historic treaty areas are really a response to a Canadian desire. This desire and transition from colonialism proper, meaning colonialism by European nations, to settler colonialism. And I'm certain many people here are likely aware of the difference between those two. And what we've seen in the onset of Canada's own trajectory in history was this influence by the United States, this idea of a manifest destiny, this idea that Canada can truly be this empire, this British colony to secure itself from foreign interests like American or Spanish or French influence. And so it was a race for land. And that's what it's been for a very long time. And many of the actions and the acts and legislation still in place today are largely reinforcing the power of the state to control and continue to control assets and land. But it also goes even further. In order to control land, there's often a discussion of how we control people. And I'll get into that discussion in a moment, but I think I want to address that history in a more intimate kind of context through the stories I heard growing up. I'd often heard about these stories, sometimes fragmented, sometimes really emotional, and sometimes they were just the sorrows and pains of Métis people gathered around a fire growing up. So Fishing Lake is a unique community because everyone there are descendants of a displaced population from St. Paul de Métis. And St. Paul de Métis is the first federally recognized Métis reserve, federally established and recognized for the purposes of assimilating Métis people and to disconnect them from their traditional activities, particularly activities related to hunting, fishing, and gathering, and to create a sedentary living pattern for Métis people, something that was unsuccessful largely, which is largely the reason the colony closed down. But before that, we have to back up a little bit more and think about what was in the minds of people like Sir John A. Macdonald, the very first prime minister in our country, that said they're going to unite this country with two bands of steel. That quote, uniting this country with two bands of steel, is in direct relation to the railway projects. And there's a really interesting history in Canada that's playing out even today on how large scale national infrastructure projects are in direct relationship with conversations about land, conversations about title, and conversation about colonization and occupation. These are intrinsically tied, these two discussions. And throughout that time, even today, that question is still largely unanswered. So Métis people going into 1869, just a few years after Canada was created in 1867, had to deal with this reality, this mentality, this promise of a type of manifest destiny that Canada wanted to employ on behalf of the Crown. And that manifest destiny, although lacking a cavalry, certainly didn't lack bullets, certainly didn't lack machine guns, and certainly didn't lack violence. The creation of the railroad pit Indigenous people in direct conflict with a new regime, a settler colonial regime, a Canadian regime for the very first time. It really transitioned from the historic relationship under the Royal Proclamation with Britain and Indigenous people, even treaties signed with Quebecois, or those formerly known as members of New France. We've seen this total disconnect from that history and that legacy into this very violent era of Canadianism, nation building, and settler colonialism. When Canada decided that they were going to unite the country by way of confederation and bring British Columbia into the fold and to prohibit and stop the United States from accessing the prairie territories, what we quickly noticed was that they were willing to do that by any means. And the Royal Proclamation sets up criteria for what type of means the government may employ in order to have Indigenous people, quote unquote, surrender the land, a framework that doesn't exist in Indigenous people's framework. This idea that land can, one, be owned, but two, have exclusive autonomy and exclusive authority held by oligarchs largely, or even individuals. And so we see this conflict of worlds and realities. And Canada took the approach that they would do this by way of treaty. They would, as per the Royal Proclamation, stated there's a few ways to take land from Indigenous people, and one of them was, of course, to conquer them. So they cited parts of that conquering during New France's participation and settlement of the St. Lawrence Basin. They also looked at ways, for example, treaty or surrender agreements, which would look at Canada's access or Canadians' access or the British Empire's access to lands. And then displacement. There was large discussions on how we actually move or forcefully move Indigenous people from areas of critical importance that were just largely within the interests of Canada, something that was seen as recently as Stephen Harper and his movement of Inuit folks further north. This is a practice still today. So this history isn't very far away, and we can learn a lot from it. And many people, particularly myself, have been influenced largely by this history. So my family would often talk about this experience of families from the Red River fleeing, families from Batoche fleeing. And my family is actually a combination of two large Métis groups, Métis refugees or migrants fleeing from conflict in Red River and in Batoche and parts of Saskatchewan. And my other side of my Métis family, because I'm from two Métis families, were fur trappers in northern Alberta, largely supplying fur trade and largely living in peace and without conflict until they were forced to. So these two groups kind of came together in the early 20th century, which created a new movement, in many ways a forgotten movement, a third resistance, we can call it. Many might be familiar with the first resistance Métis people put up in the Red River. We prohibited access of the Canadian government and officials, particularly Thomas Scott, his name was. He was the appointed Governor General of the Northwest Territories, which included the prairies at that time. He illegally entered the territory of the Red River, and just like any nation would, we defended our property and our ability to protect what we thought was ours. So we arrested Thomas Scott. And under a fair judicious process, he was charged with treason and conspiracy to commit essentially an overthrowing of our duly elected Métis government. He was executed by firing squad for this, for bringing weapons and this intent to hurt the community at that time. The government took that extremely poorly and failed to negotiate in good faith and resulted in armed conflict at Fort Garry. Métis people, we took Fort Garry as a means to expel the British forces from occupying that territory and to really outline a list of demands, which became known as the Manitoba Act. And so the Manitoba Act is really critical to this story, really critical to Canada, because the first time Indigenous people, outside of just Quebecois asking for national demands within a federational model, but the Métis people, for the first time, were willing to negotiate their access to federalism, their access to what Canada could be as a country. And we entered into the Manitoba Act by way of the provisional legislature. So Louis Riel moved to adopt the Manitoba Act, and my great-great-great-grandfather, Pierre Patra, seconded that act. My great-great-great-grandfather unfortunately died 3 days after he signed it, because 3 days after the government got what they wanted and the signatories required to empower the Manitoba Act, they largely began a large-scale exodus of Métis people by forcing many of them outside of the region, forcing them to migrate to Saskatchewan by way of huge levels of violence and migration. We've seen Canada move a ton of migrants into Manitoba before the Act allowed them to, and actively displace Métis people, which resulted in dysphoria into Saskatchewan, where there are already existing Métis people. So Métis people fleeing one particular region to go see their family in another region. There's a myth I want to warn people about within the Métis context, that Métis people come from the Red River. That is not exclusively true. Métis people occupy a large district, a large commercial area in many ways. It's largely motivated, their placement's largely motivated by the fur trade. And wherever there was fur trading, there were often Métis people. So that doesn't mean that they were exclusive to the Red River. And in many ways, their origin point is actually Cumberland House, the British post on the Hudson's Bay. But we're not going to go into that history. I think that what we've seen in many ways was this continuous movement and this continuous pushing, I guess you can say, of Métis people further and further into the West. But there's also conflicts that continue to arise. And as Canada formed its national identity, it started to scapegoat in many ways Métis people, just like other Indigenous people, into tropes and to myths that really allowed for our disenfranchisement. And we still experience that today. After these two huge historic events, this is where the history kind of falls off, and many folks forget that Métis people continued to resist and continue to fight for access to land in particular. And so in Alberta, many Métis people gathered. There was two groups of Métis people at this time. Métis people who could not self-identify as Quebecois, French, and were not white passing. And this is a reality that is often forgotten about. Many Métis people who could not pass as white were forced to live often on the edges of reserves and road allowances. And many people who could pass as white were lost to our nation. They were pressured, forced, and oftentimes coerced, and sometimes even forcefully married to persons that were not Indigenous in order to find a way to reduce the population of Métis people. So we've seen a major decrease in representation of Métis people during the first part of the 20th century. The largest amount of non-identifying Métis people, even though they were existing. But you didn't want to say you were Métis, or you'd likely get arrested or face tremendous barriers. My family could not identify as anything other than Métis at the time. We were not white passing, and my great great grandfather, my mom's chapang, his name was Charlie Delorme. And Charlie Delorme was one of a Métis activist. He couldn't speak English, but he spoke most other languages, especially Indigenous languages. And on the reserve of Frog Lake, for those who are familiar, Frog Lake First Nations is where my other half of my family comes from, my grandmother's family. He gathered at the border of Frog Lake, and he asked fellow Métis people to gather, and people who didn't sign treaties to gather. And at this gathering in the early 20th century, they had a list of demands. part of that list of demands was access to land and territory. They had the wherewithal to know that a very powerful and sub-constitutional agreement was about to take place between the newly established province of Alberta and Canada, which was called the Natural Resources Transfers Act. And the Natural Resources Transfers Act allowed provinces, particularly Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, to begin allocating resources related to land exclusive of the federal crown. So it created a system where the provincial government could isolate Indigenous people, and Métis people in this time were in complete destitute, and they were lacking basic provisions of health and education. And there was even a royal commission called the Ewing Commission, which was enacted in Alberta in order to investigate the well-being of what was then called half-breed populations. This population in Alberta was investigated and largely made up what was then identifiable Métis populations in Alberta. And so they traveled across largely northern Alberta to get testimony from doctors, from local representatives, and even from Métis people themselves. Simultaneous to that history, there was a group of 5 people that that petition group I was telling you about. They were able to hire eventually, because they charged membership, I think it was like 5 cents per member, enough to pay for travel expenses for an executive that they would elect or appoint, actually, to start with. And that was led by J.F. Dion, who was an enfranchised Indian from the Kihiwan First Nations. And for those who aren't familiar, he did get formally educated, but it resulted in him surrendering his recognized Indian status in Kihiwan, which was unfortunate. He did, however, continue his fight for Indigenous people across the board, and particularly Métis people he grew up with in St. Paul, that he watched get kicked out and displaced. And he had a very big soft heart for them and for us. And he was literate, and he was able to write, and that was huge. That's where most of our evidence comes from in this era. And so the amount of funding that was able to be demanded and the amount of land that was able to be demanded by these petitions was extraordinary. It was proposing allotments of 11 colonies in Alberta that would be for the exclusive benefit of Métis people. And 8 years passed by, and finally, during the province's most destitute times in the 1930s, Alberta wasn't immune to the huge decrease in wealth and the markets crashing in the United States. We had a depression. And so the government found it expedient and cheap, financially cheap, to simply allocate lands rather than pay for doctors and nurses and things like this. They just allowed the Métis people their demands, which were the land allocation. Those land allocations were created under a recognition of a provincial legislation known as the Métis Betterment Act. It established 11 colonies, which would eventually become 12 colonies, which over the preceding decade would become 8. And fast forward, we finally, when I was born in the early 90s, signed an agreement that we sued the government of Alberta on. In 1989, we settled that lawsuit, which was the largest lawsuit in Alberta's history at that time of an Aboriginal group against the government, and resulted in $300 million of support or of payment to the Métis people of the settlements for their abolishing of those former colonies, but more particular to the stealing of natural resources, the oil boom, which largely took place on Métis settlements. And so fast forward now, during this whole period of time, there were other social factors affecting the communities. There was particular to that, the residential schools, the 60 scoop, and the existing CFS system. And so how my family plays into all of that story, which is another layer on top of all of this displacement, is starts with a woman named Brenda. And Brenda is someone who's fascinating to me, but also I think someone whose story helps to shed light on experiences of Indigenous people still today. And one I think hopefully provides other Indigenous people, at least from knowing my experience, how proud I am for the things she's done. Even though many conventional people may say that she was worthless or valueless, I see the exact opposite. I see her as one of the strongest people. Even though there was times in my life I had serious questions and even felt as though I was unloved from her, but it's particular because she didn't know how. And what I mean by that is she was born in the 60s. And of course, like many Indigenous children in the 60s, she was apprehended under the government's then liberal policy. Rather than place children in residential schools, which was becoming extraordinarily expensive for the government, they found a cheaper way to attempt to kill the Indian child, and that was to place them into existing homes of non-Indigenous families. And so there was 12 siblings, and of those 12 siblings, 11 were taken, and one was excluded. That one was hidden away for a while and traveled many families, and we'll get to who that was in a moment. But within that other 11, there was one in particular named Brenda, who was apprehended out of the Lloydminster community, just outside of Lloydminster. She was living on a road allowance, the Métis community that's now no longer there. But she was living there and she was apprehended, and she was taken to 17 non-Indigenous homes. And throughout that time, she experienced huge amounts of abuse, from spiritual, sexual, emotional abuse, and a kind of abuse no child should have to endure. You know, a child, it's unbelievable to imagine how sad and lonely and devastating that would be for a child, to continuously bounced around and to feel you have no one on your side, and to feel that you've been completely abandoned and no one is really looking out for you. So Brenda survived this terrible system. And that's where most of my gratitude comes from, is she decided not to give up, like my aunt, her sister, who would go on to commit suicide. She struggled a huge amount in her life, and was unfortunately, she didn't survive the effects of the 60s scoop, and she died in her very early 40s. She, after aging out of the system, she was dropped off in Edmonton, Alberta, where as a young Indigenous woman, especially in the 80s, you know, the 70s and 80s, very difficult time. And she terrible experiences. And I won't go into what many of those experiences are, but it was, she wrote about it much later on, with the help of some folks. And it's truly devastating and sad, but she did survive, which is massive. Sorry. She did survive, which is massive, but she survived in unconventional ways, or maybe more conventional for Aboriginal women, particular to that time. And she entered the sex work industry in Edmonton, Alberta, and she did that work on Alberta Avenue, largely, the district I represent today. And so it's been interesting as a member of parliament and meeting some of the old timers and some of the people who actually even knew her, who are still living on the streets today, who are still living without a home. And it's almost like there was a family that she had created, and a family that's truly there. And that requires recognition that they're our family and they're still in pain, they still need our help. But she, as an individual, was able to do that work, and she survived for as long as she had, and she gave birth to 4 children. Brenda had 4 children, all of which were apprehended, including myself at birth. My oldest brother, and I'm still doing this work. I'm still right now actively trying to connect with these individuals who are my relatives, but they've been spread across the entire country. I recently, in the last 10 years or 5 years, I've connected with one of my siblings who is in Montreal. He doesn't speak English. His name is Monty. He's much older, and Monty grew up not knowing anything about where he was from, who he is. Nothing. He was only told that he was saved and that he was brought to a better home. Even though he wouldn't have agreed that that home he was raised in was good, he did know that he wanted a better life for his children. And so when he did have children, which he does now, he's more curious about our history, more curious about who we are than he had been in his life. Parts of what it means to create and rebuild our families and our kinship. I have another brother, younger than him, who's in prison and incarcerated. He's not white passing like my oldest brother, and has been incarcerated for some time. I think 3 or 4 years now, largely to do with addiction and trying to support himself through petty theft under 5,000 that just continuously racked up. And then I have a half sister as well who she passed away. I never met her. She died at 22 years old, and she also was a sex worker, but she unfortunately didn't make it. And this is probably one of the most terrible parts of this story is I wasn't informed of, as her next of kin even, and I didn't even know I was a next of kin to anybody, of her passing. She died in Vancouver. She was missing for upwards of 6 months before her body was found. And in her police report, it states that she was hit by a bus. But there's no evidence to suggest there was a bus or or anything, just that there was blunt trauma force to her head. And she was buried without any relatives, without anyone, in a strange place, and given a state funeral. And so that's my family. And I'm although it's difficult for many people maybe to hear that, it means a lot for me to even know this. Just the fact that I know, because there were so many questions growing up as to what happened and where everyone was, that it meant a lot for me to finally hear the truth, even how grim it is. It's important to know that truth. Myself now, the last child of this intergenerational trauma and story of Brenda's family, was that out of all of her children, at the very end, she made a very courageous decision. She didn't want her youngest and her last child, myself, to have to endure this reality, to continue to create this cycle of violence that she had known was happening to her children, one that she had lived through, and she knew exactly what was going to happen to the other children. She wanted to prevent that. So she asked for a phone book, and she was at the hospital at this time, and she wanted to phone my mother, the mother who raised me, her half sister, Grace. They'd barely known each other. She had never grown up with her, but my mom, Grace, had a vested interest in reuniting her family because she had had all of her siblings robbed, and she was with her mother and father when they completely spiraled out of control after losing their children. So she knows what it's like to want to be in a family. She knows what it's like to want to have that back. And so that oldest sibling, her name was Grace, and so she picked up the phone the evening of my birth, and the doctors, she was transferred to the University of Alberta Hospital, and they simply said, "I'm not certain if this baby will survive. You know, you've been on drugs for a very long time, Brenda, and you're high right now." And she was on drugs at my time of my birth, and they really thought I wasn't going to survive as a baby. And they were of the solid conclusion that there was a likelihood I would die, but I was for sure going to be apprehended. And so the first people I had met in this world was actually CFS workers. The social worker was there, a lawyer was there, an officer was there. Of course, I don't remember these things. These are all accounts from the court, which eventually the mother who raised me, Grace, would fight for custody, and these facts would be present. And so it took tremendous courage to phone a stranger and say, "Will you take my baby?" But it stands an even greater testament to the type of folks our Indigenous people are. Truly forgiving, truly welcoming, and truly loving. She, without hesitation, said yes. Grace took her last $20. She hitchhiked to St. Paul, Alberta, took the first bus, then the red-eye bus, and got to Edmonton the next morning. I was born very small. I was a very small baby. They were very concerned, and they wanted, however, me to exit the hospital as soon as possible. And Grace, her very first act was, "No, you need to ensure this baby can survive." And so I was held at the university in prenatal for 3 days until all of my vitals came back okay, and I was okay to go home. And over the next 6 months, Grace would fight for custody. She knew exactly what this system was made of because she had been a longtime activist against the 60 Scoop, working from within the system. So she had actually tipped off about 50 people in her time in service of CFS, tipped off 50 families to have their children flee from custody. And this was found out in her time, and she was let go because of this. Many Indigenous families still reach out to her and myself today to say thank you for that act of courage by Grace. But she took me, and she didn't want any kind of connection to the CFS system. She knew that they would continuously harass and they would continuously attempt to take children, particularly me and her own children. So she fought in court for 6 months, and finally the Crown, under a recommendation of at that time was a new system called Kinship Care, this pilot project, this idea that Indigenous people could raise their own children, even if they weren't their immediate family. She won that case, particularly because the Crown's prosecutor was very ineffective, but they were ineffective for a very good reason, because they wanted to see kinship care as an option. And so the typical court proceedings they weren't so typical. There was a lot of concessions made by the Crown, and they largely dropped many allegations against our family, which resulted in my full adoption. My life was saved. And I can't stress enough how those few moments changed my entire life forever. You know, this idea that I was wanted, I belonged, that I wasn't going to be a child lost or die the same way my own family had. A whole generation of Indigenous people have changed because of it. And I hope that we can continue to change and save Indigenous children, because that's where it starts. Children are the most important parts of our nation. And we can rebuild our nation. I've seen it. I've been part of it. I'm an example of what a nation, a small, poor nation like the Fishing Lake Métis settlement could do. No one makes more than, no one makes living wage. Many members don't have clean water. Many members don't have adequate housing. But many people have a unity, a kinship, a traditional base of laws that keep our nations united still today. And I couldn't be more grateful for that. And when I learn about the laws of reciprocity, when I learn about the laws of ensuring that we chip away at some of the historic debt and intergenerational trauma, we also learn about what it means to have or invoke intergenerational healing. You know, this is a part of our work we often never talk about, is the healing that's been done in between generations, and particularly by women and Two-Spirit people. They provided a system for hundreds of years that has maintained our nation's ability to reclaim our children, reclaim identity, reclaim language. These systems have to be protected and really have to be supported, because they're truly how we're going to ensure our nations are intact and people can live a life where they are truly living in dignity, living with the inheritance that they deserve as a proud Indigenous people and people who've survived a terrible and atrocious time, and people who continue to be resilient. There's a really beautiful teaching in that. And no matter what happens, the next generation will pick it up, and they're going to do as much as they can, even 10 times fold what can be done to ensure that justice, but also healing happens. And I hope to play a role in that, supporting healing, supporting what it truly means to rebuild a nation from prohibiting kinds of actions that would harm them. People often ask, Blake, why are you an MP? You know, why do that work? It's important to ensure that we take a harm reduction approach to our institutions. You know, we don't have to see Canada's institutions as solving problems, but we can see them as ones that we can limit harm. We can limit pain. We can limit the amount of violence that takes place. You know, I do this very often. Even today and this whole week, I've been questioning in my committees the Deputy Ministers of Indigenous Services Canada and Crown Indigenous Relations. And I'll tell you, you can go watch them. They're harsh. I am unsatisfied and not impressed with how this country is continuing to govern over Indigenous people without their input, without any remorse, nearly any remorse for the conditions Indigenous people still live in today. It's truly tragic what continues to happen in our country. And I don't want to go too far into that because I know that we're running out of time, but I do want to give time for folks to ask questions. But I really do appreciate being here with all of you. It really means a lot to me to have this audience and to say hello to everyone. And I hope I was able to provide some part of my story that can give you something that you feel maybe you need in your own lives, or that you can share with people. You know, that's really why I do this work and why I share my story, so that it can be shared even more, that folks can find the strength that I've been given in it. Because none of this is, there's no extraordinary aspect about me. It's an extraordinary aspect about our nation. That's truly needs to be recognized. But thanks so much, friends. Kinem come to Noel, and I'll hand it off to Casey. Thanks so much, Casey.
No, thank you so much, Blake. That was super moving. It was incredible to hear you weaving your ancestral story with your own story into that kind of historical history of Canada. I know it was powerful for me. It was powerful to hear your story. It was powerful to hear your family story. It was powerful to hear Canada's story through that lens. And I know just from the comments, very moving. Thanks for sharing your story. And I echo that 100 times over. Thank you again. So as we wait for some of the questions to roll in, I was thinking about kind of that your own family's parts in ways of resistance and the intergenerational injustices that kind of flowed since and are ongoing. And I was brought back to our theme, bringing our children, law, and traditions back to the home fire. And particularly when you talked about your own adoption and that a whole generation of Indigenous people have been saved because of it. And that's just, it's very powerful. And so I'm wondering if you may be able to tell us a little bit about what that phrase, bringing our children, laws, and traditions home means to you.
Oh, well, bringing our children anywhere is a massive feat because it's said in the old people's way that, they see different things. Children go where they're needed and children know what needs to be blessed. And I always thought, what a beautiful teaching, and every child and many children where I grew up were called little elder. No matter if they're little or big, they were just something they would say to them. They would treat them with this kind of dignity, this platform, this something we don't do enough, which is really hold our children up as leaders and educators and healers. And when we do that, they often guide our work and they will remind us of laws. And something that I was taught really young, not really young, but when I was going to university in Victoria, I had worked on the Indigenous Jewish doctorate program as a researcher with John Burroughs. He was the leader in that work, but I'd worked actually with Valerie Napoleon in part of the framework aspect of it, storytelling aspect. And I'd grown up with a lot of stories, really beautiful stories from elders like Florence Peranto, if those who know, or Elmer Ghostkeeper. He worked at the university for some time. I grew up with him, or Tom DeRocher, my uncle and godfather, who's really wise. They remind you every single time of how important children are. As lawmakers, the children are the lawmakers. They're the ones guiding us. And I think that's an important thing we have to reframe in our minds as to how do we support children in the work they're doing here? Because they're here to do a job too, just like every one of us. And their place here is often to bring healing and to remind us of those really sacred laws. And when I think about bringing children home, I think about the laws they bring with them. I think about the teachings they bring with them. And to end on that question, I had once been really frustrated with the lack of Indigenous stories that were remaining in my community. Many are gone. And I was so frustrated and I was angry and had a lot of hate. I just so upset with history, how things went down. And Valerie Napoleon, she calmed me down. She gave me a glass of water, gave me some food, some fruits and vegetables, and just said, Blake, eat this. Eat this for a second. I ate that and took a moment for me to gather my strength again. And she followed up with, how do you think these stories got to our people? Do you think we just made them up by ourselves? And she said, no. And I said, no, they didn't. Said, they were gifted to our people. They were gifted to us. All of the bundles our nation has, sorry, I should back up. The word bundle, let's just use that word. I can go on forever about that, but let's use it right now for this purpose as meaning a collection of laws, a type of collection of laws. Many bundles have been lost to our nation, but they're all gifts and they can be re-gifted because the people or the energy we got them from was the land and from the spirits who guard our land. They come from our teachings and our bundles come from there, not from us or not from some kind of sacred inheritance from an ancestor 1,000 years ago. Our ancestors were guardians of these bundles, not the owners of them, and they're gifted. And these bundles, although they may be lost to us now, aren't lost forever. There will be a time when these bundles return to us when our people are ready, when our time is ready. And it is often children who are the ones who will bring our bundles home. So I really think this is a very good theme for how we talk about laws, because I really do think they come from those bundles, and those bundles are safeguarded by our children.
Thank you so much for that. That was a beautiful teaching. And kind of along those lines, Do you have any words of encouragement for the young people and the little elders who are seeing their reflection in you and wondering how to walk in those two worlds, really reconciling their identity with kind of the power that those institutions have historically held over our people?
Well, advice, I'd say we need you. We need you now more than ever. There has never been a time in our history where we've been more divided, more nervous, more scared, more lost. And we see it, we see it in every society across the world today. But children have a very special power, which is to give us the energy to see past the division and to see the unity that's really connects all of us, to see the things that connect us. Because I'm sure all of you have children in your lives and will know that when they're interested in playing on the playground, it doesn't matter who else is there. It only matters if they're willing to play. And there's lessons there and laws we have to teach ourselves for that. And so if there's any message about walking in two worlds, it's we need that perspective. We need Indigenous youth in leadership positions, whatever that leadership role may be. Maybe a leadership in your community, maybe leadership in the kindergarten or grade school or all the way up to university. There are roles that need people to be kind and compassionate. And I think that the principles of walking in two worlds are needed now because it demonstrates that you don't have to live on one side or the other to be whole. You can be whole and understand both systems and understand how both of them interact and to know when it's appropriate to draw the line and when it's appropriate to speak up. I think there's a superpower in doing that. And I just can't wait to see and meet all the young leaders we have right now. I'm just so excited to do that. I'm meeting some today. Casey, you're a leader. Everyone here is a leader, and just it's really remarkable to see it. Something that I never would have imagined in my life.
Yeah, thank you for that. I do see ILSA has her hand up, so I will go to you, ILSA.
Perfect, thank you. Hi, Blake. Thank you so much for speaking with us today. It's been just really great. I am a member of Wood Mountain First Nation. I'm studying at the U of A, and I'm just on a co-op term to help implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People for the country. And I just have a question about communicating. I heard that you were on a diversity and inclusion task force in your introduction. Could you talk a little bit about communicating the difference between diversity and inclusion and treaty rights holders and how it's so important? Yeah, just it's the difference in, I can't talk.
I think I got your question, Alyssa. If I could reframe it, the difference between minority rights and Indigenous rights.
Sure.
Yeah, huge difference. There's the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is really important framework because it allows us for a foundation globally to exercise an understanding of Indigenous rights. And I think when we look at particular aspects, I'll mention Article 6 of the United Nations Declaration, which is particular to Indigenous people may participate in the social, cultural, and economic activities of the state while protecting their sovereignty and Indigenous rights and access to territory. That's so important, that one right there, just slams home the reality that regardless of these political systems, in many ways, artificial political national systems do not diminish or unrecognize Indigenous rights, sovereign rights we're born with, because the rights that a country recognizes and the rights that our creator through spiritual means grants us are completely different and unreconcilable, to be really frank. And so I think we need to operate with both frameworks. When we think about our rights, it should come from this sovereign place of understanding that our obligations to our nation and to our land are different than the obligations we have to our civil rights and to our engagement in civil society. And I think the United Nations draws that line really well. Down the line, it says, these are the systems that are employed to create, organization of states, but here's an exclusive list of rights that can never be diminished, can never be forgotten. And I've had the pleasure of working with Dr. Littlechilds and with Elmer Ghostkeeper and Romeo Saganash in the development and eventually the passing of the United Nations Declaration. Still a lot of work to go, still tons of work, particularly in enforcement and amendments to regulatory laws in Canada to make it forceful. But that's a really great question because minority rights, we can often make accommodations to minority rights in order to create a system of fairness, but we cannot accommodate the diminishment of Indigenous rights. Those are unaccommodatable. They must be accommodated by other systems. There's a supremacy to those laws. But great question, Alyssa.